Welcome to the worship services of the Graymere Church of Christ. The next few minutes are designed to help you with everyday living, finding our answers from God's Word.
If you haven't already turned to John chapter 6, I would encourage you to turn there. We're going to be looking at some other passages in the Gospels, but this morning we continue a series that we've been going through looking at what John refers to as signs in his Gospel. And at the end of the book of John, we find out why these signs are recorded. John tells us it's recorded so that we might believe in Jesus and that we might have life because of that belief. So these are signs of life, signs that bring us faith that leads to life. And as we think about the passage that James just read for us, we're also going to be thinking back to what we looked at last week, as thousands of people were fed through the miraculous power of Jesus. As we begin, I want to ask a question. Now, this question is a little bit unfair. It's unfair because we've been on fall break, and many of you have been out of school, and you've been able to go on trips. We have our group that was on our mission trip that's just back, and so I know it isn't good for me to bring this up. But what did you think about school when you were growing up? What were your memories of sitting in the classroom? They might have been positive, some of them might have been negative, but what did you experience? What are some lessons you can remember learning going to school? You've probably heard the old joke about the mother that goes into her son's bedroom on the first day of school after summer vacation, and she wakes her son up and she says, "It's time to go to school. It's the first day of school. You've got to get up on time." And he says, "No, there's no way I'm going." And he covers his head with his pillow. And he said, "I hate going to that school. I hate walking in that building. No one there likes me. I don't have any friends. All of the teachers hate me. I have to spend all day doing things I don't want to do. There is no way that I'm going to get up and I'm going to go to school." And his mother very calmly sits down at the foot of his bed and says, "There are 3 reasons you're going to need to get up and go to school today. One is I've made an incredible breakfast that's sitting on the kitchen table. All your favorite breakfast foods are there to get your day started off right. The second is everyone's going to be expecting you. People are going to be waiting to see you there. And the third is you are the principal, and people want you to be there the first day of school." I've been around a lot of teachers in my life, and I know a lot of people who work in teaching, and sometimes teachers feel the same way students do when it's time to get up and get ready to go to school. I don't know what your experience was like, but there's one thing all of us learned, no matter where we went to school and no matter what we thought about it. Everything builds on what you already know. Just think about that. If you're learning math facts in 3rd and 4th grade, and multiplication tables, and here's how you divide one number into another, you've got to know those facts for you to really understand what happens in algebra. And you've got to know what happens in algebra to really understand what happens in algebra 2. And as you go on down the line, whether it's calculus or trigonometry or whatever advanced math courses you take, those basic facts have to be there. Or if you're studying a language, you know how important it is to know the alphabet and to know those basic words and the basic sentence structure, because you won't be able to advance far beyond if you don't know those basics. If you're learning to play an instrument, the same thing is true. You've got to know, if you want to read music, what a quarter note is and what a whole note is. And you've got to know how to produce certain notes on an instrument for you to ever achieve some of the more advanced skills. No matter what it is in life, we have to learn those foundational principles if we really want to advance. And the same is true in our spiritual lives. There are times I need to learn some spiritual foundational lessons if I ever want to advance in my spiritual growth. We read about this sometimes even in the New Testament. The contrast of milk versus meat even. Times where some Christians should have been able to receive meat, but they had to have milk. They weren't ready for that advanced material. They had to have that foundation laid again. And we see it even in the lives of the apostles. The miracle that we just read about from the book of John is also recorded in Matthew and Mark. And what Mark tells us is at the end of this miracle, when Jesus has walked on the water and the disciples are amazed, Mark tells us why they were amazed. They were amazed because they hadn't learned the lesson of the loaves. Jesus had just taken what amounts to a small lunch from a boy, just a few small pieces of bread, some fish that probably would have been about the size of sardines, and he's fed thousands and thousands of people with it. But there was something about that lesson that the apostles needed to learn. And because they hadn't learned it, they were amazed when Jesus walked on the water. And so this morning, in a sense, we're going to sit down and go to school with Jesus. We're going to learn what Jesus wants us to learn from these miracles that are recorded in John. And as we do that, we're reminded of the scene, the setting here. In verse 16 of John, evening comes, the disciples go down to the sea. They get in a boat and they start across the sea to Capernaum. It's been interesting to see what researchers have found about the Sea of Galilee and about that area that can be famous, even notorious, for the storms that seem to spring up. Something about the cold currents of the water and the way the winds come in, that there are storms that can form in just a matter of a few minutes. And all of a sudden, you're right in the midst of a storm. We see that more than once in the Gospels. And so they're there. It's now dark. Jesus had not yet come to them, and the sea becomes rough because a strong wind is blowing. And before I can apply this miracle, the lessons that are here to my own life, I need to see what Jesus was teaching his disciples in this incredible sign. And I think the first thing we see very clearly is that Jesus is more powerful than the chaos that was around him. Before I understand how this applies to me, I need to know what it would have meant to them. And Jesus is showing them his power over the chaos. Here you have the wind that's blowing, that's making it incredibly difficult, and yet Jesus is more powerful. You may know that in the ancient world, the sea was often associated with chaos. The sea was dangerous and scary. And we can understand why, because when a sea floods, all of a sudden there are serious problems that are there. Crops could be ruined. Someone could be set back, either financially or even physically, unable to survive because of the flooding of the sea. So you can imagine in the ancient world, the sea was seen as very dangerous and chaotic. There were even pagan gods that were seen to be over the sea. And that's why people would have wanted to serve those gods, to keep the sea from being an enemy. We know how uncontrollable the sea can be and how uncontrollable floods can be, and rain and storms. It wasn't too long ago that even in the Middle Tennessee area, there was that flooding that took place that caused drastic damage in many homes across this area. I can still remember, we were living in southern Kentucky. I remember getting up that morning and it had been raining all day Saturday and trying to go to the church building, and one whole street where you could enter into our parking lot was flooded, and so you had to go to the next street over. After worship, one of the members got a call that there was flooding that was taking place in his home, and so you had a group of people that got together and they went over and they went to his house and tried to salvage what they could of the furniture and everything. And then when we watched the news and started seeing posts on Facebook, we saw even more damage done all over this area. We know how dangerous and uncontrollable that can be. I think of the work that many of you have done in working with the Pearlington Church over the years, still recovering in many aspects from the devastation of Hurricane Katrina. We understand how all of these things can be devastating and damaging, and yet Jesus is more powerful than the chaos. I think there's something significant there. It's significant to understand that even in Jesus' ministry, there were times when things were chaotic around him, but did you notice that Jesus is always calm? He always manages to keep a cool head and a clear head when things are going on. More than once in his ministry, there was a crowd of people that wanted to take his life. Can you imagine what that would be like? And yet Jesus passes through them. Of course, he's the Son of God, so he can pass through them without them being able to see what's happening. But he remains calm. Or how many times did the Pharisees try to trap Jesus with a question? Can you imagine being caught in front of so many people, asked a difficult question, and they're wanting to catch you, they're wanting to trap you? I would get nervous if it were me. My palms would start to sweat. My mind would start racing, and yet Jesus remains calm and asks them questions back that always put them in their place. Even in the garden, after Jesus has prayed and agonized over what's going to happen, when the soldiers come to arrest Jesus, Jesus is the one who has the cool head. Peter pulls out his sword. Peter strikes the ear off of one of those who have come to arrest him, but Jesus tells him to put his sword back. He heals Malchus because he understands what needs to happen. And as he's led through this mockery of a trial, every step of the way, people are upset, people are furious, but Jesus remains calm. Jesus is a calming presence, even in the midst of chaos. He's more powerful than the storm. He's more powerful than chaos. And his power over the elements here is proof that he is the Messiah. More than once in the Old Testament, we see evidence that God is the one who controls the sea. God is the one who controls the elements of nature. For example, in the book of Job, chapter 9 and verse 8, Job describes God as one who tramples on the sea. And towards the end of the book, when God comes back to Job and he's sort of putting Job in his place and reminding him of who he is and who God is, in Job 38, he spends several verses talking about the fact that God is the one who has told the sea, "This far you should go and no farther." Just take a look through the Psalms and you see how many times the psalmist describes God as being in control of nature. Or even the prophet Isaiah. In Isaiah 51 in verse 10, Isaiah reminds us that God is the one who has power over the waters of the great deep. And so for Jesus to have more power than a storm, than chaos, would have been incredibly significant. This isn't the only time that happens either. If you look over in Mark chapter 4, we see a storm that is calmed simply by the statement Jesus made. And look at verse 37. A great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But when he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion, speaking of Jesus, and they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" I can remember a couple of years ago when our son Luke was about 3, and he was telling us this story of Jesus calming the storm. And according to his version, Jesus just had to stand up and say, "Please be still," and the seas calmed down. We figured out that's probably because he's heard us say several times, "Please be still," and so that was just in his mind, "Please be still." It was kind of a funny thing, but it's worth noting that Jesus didn't have to say please. He didn't have to beg the storm to stop. He didn't have to plead with it. He had the power to stand up and say, "Peace, be still." And that's the question that his apostles were asking. Who is this that the winds and the waves, that the sea, which is so chaotic, it obeys him? It's proof that he's the Messiah. Now, we spend all this time looking at what it would have meant to them because we need to know what this means to us. And I have to ask myself if I really believe that Jesus is more powerful than chaos. Do you remember what he said in the passage we began with? As the apostles saw him, he said, "Take heart, it is I." Other Gospels would tell us as we compare the accounts in Matthew and Mark, he says, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." He's letting them know they don't have to fear. And he doesn't say, "Take heart, this storm isn't really that bad." "Take heart, these waves aren't really that high, it's not really that big a deal." Or "Take heart, you're almost close to shore, it will be over in just a few minutes." Jesus says, "Take heart, it is I." Jesus is giving them his presence. And it's worth noting that in our lives, God does not minimize the chaos that's around us, but he gives us his presence. Do I really believe that the God I serve is more powerful than the chaos that's around me? Am I willing to stake my life on that claim? Have you ever thought about why children run to their parents' bedrooms at night if they hear storm and they get scared, or if they have a nightmare that scares them? The storm isn't going to be any softer from another bedroom in the house. And if they fall asleep again, they might have another nightmare, but there's something about the presence of someone you love, the presence of someone who's concerned about you that makes all the difference. Jesus is giving them his presence. And there are times when we're in the midst of chaos and we're in the midst of struggle, and Jesus will say, "Peace, be still," and that struggle will cease. And there are other times when the waves will continue and the storm will continue, and we're reminded that we have God's presence with us in the storm. We don't always know which one it's going to be, but I have to ask myself, do I believe that Jesus is more powerful than the chaos? And do I believe that Jesus is more powerful than my own fears? This would have been a very fearful time for the apostles. Mark's account tells us that when Jesus is on the mountain, he's on the land, and they're on the sea, he looks out and he sees the fact that these experienced fishermen are having trouble making any headway because the waves are so great. And he comes to them, and there's something very interesting. If you look at Mark's account in Mark chapter 6, I just want to read you the way that Mark phrases this, because I think it's significant. In verse 48, they're making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night, so we're thinking about 3 a.m. to 6 a.m., somewhere in that time frame, he came to them walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out. Now, just stop for a moment, because if we're reading through and we say Jesus went to pass by them, we ask ourselves, well, what does that mean? Was he on his way somewhere else and he just sort of walked by them and they saw him? I think if we look at the context, Jesus knows they're struggling, and he means to pass by them. And the term that's used there, the phrasing that's used for pass by, I think is a theological term. I think that because we see a couple of times in the Old Testament where God passes by someone. And in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, this same kind of term is used for passing by. So, for example, in Exodus 33, when Moses is there and he is asked God to show him his presence, and God passes by him, we see that same term used. Or in 1 Kings 19, when Elijah is there and he's exhausted and he's depressed and he's discouraged, and God takes him up and the Lord passes by him as he's on that high place. And we remember the progression of all those things that go by Elijah as God is getting his attention. And interestingly enough, we find out later on that on the Transfiguration mountain, when Jesus is there, he's there with Moses and Elijah, who had this vision of God passing by them. I believe that's what Jesus is doing as he walks on the water. He is giving them a glimpse of the fact that he is God. He's revealing himself to them. And we remember what we said just a few moments ago, that Jesus says, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." There's more than one time in Scripture where God tells his people that. In the midst of a storm, we find out, for example, in the 118th Psalm, here's how we read it. The psalmist says, "Out of my distress I called on the Lord. The Lord answered me and set me free. The Lord is on my side. I will not fear. What can man do to me?" Why won't I fear? Because the Lord is on my side. And so as we see Jesus saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Why don't they need to be afraid? Because he is here. Or if we continue reading and thinking about what we find in Isaiah 43, verses 1 through 3, look at what the prophet here tells us. "Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You were mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they will not overwhelm you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior." Why is this important? It's important because if you were to go on the internet and look at a website like Yahoo Answers, or one of those places that is trying to give you an answer for any question you might have, and you were to ask, "How can I overcome my fears?" a lot of the advice would be what you could do individually. You need to do this, and you can accomplish this. And a lot of that advice is good. There are things we can do to help minimize our fears. But if I really want to face the fears of life, I have to know who's on my side. And so it's not that they needed to take heart because they could handle the waves. They needed to take heart because Jesus was there. And as a Christian, I have this incredible gift of God's presence in my life. And so even when I'm facing fear, I can know that God is on my side. And even individuals like the apostles who were seeking to follow Jesus still had to deal with fearful situations. We sing a song with our pew packers on Sunday evenings about the wise and foolish builders. Matthew 7 is part of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus tells that parable. He describes what it's like when people build their house on the rock and build their house on a sandy foundation. And what happens in both places is a storm hits. And so I'm reminded that it doesn't matter how faithful I am, I'm going to experience the storms. It didn't matter how much time the apostles spent with Jesus, they would experience storms, and they would experience storms again. In fact, history tells us that all but one of the apostles would die the deaths of martyrs. They experienced storms in their life. So what was it that would get them through? It is I. Do not be afraid. And the English translation of the statement there in the original language, it is I, is not exactly what was said there. In the Greek it says, I am. Now that's a perfectly good statement in Greek. In English it doesn't make as much sense. But we're reminded when we read those words, I am, of the way Jesus described himself and the way he would say he, in chapter 8, for example, of John, before Abraham was, I am. As he does that, as he makes those I am statements, we're reminded of the name of God that's revealed all the way back in Exodus chapter 4. The great I am. And so even in times of fear, we have the I am on our side. And Matthew gives us another interesting detail about this walking on the water. Because he tells us what happens when Peter sees and reacts to Jesus. And when Peter sees that in Matthew chapter 15, they're terrified because of what he's doing. They're terrified because they see Jesus walking on the water, and they assume it must be a ghost. And you wonder what was going through their mind, but can you imagine what it would be like to see someone walking on the water? They're trying to come up with any explanation they can. And so the explanation it must be a ghost seems to be at least as good as any. And Peter tells Jesus, as Jesus is making himself known this way, in verse 28 of Matthew 14, he says, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. He said, come. So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water to come and came to Jesus. Now, I wish I knew more about this situation because we don't exactly know if this was a good thing that Peter does. I know sometimes we think the incredible faith it would have taken to get out of the boat, and I can understand when you're looking at the storm around you to step on water and to trust that if you're doing that and you're walking to Jesus that he will take care of you. I can understand the faith that's there, but this isn't Jesus' idea. It's Peter's idea. It's almost as if Peter's not really sure this is Jesus and says, well, if it's really you, let me come to you on the water. And actually, if we keep reading through the book of Matthew, there are a lot of instances in the next few chapters where Peter says and does things that aren't necessarily very flattering for Peter. In fact, if we're just flipping through these chapters, in chapter 15, for example, he would ask for an explanation of a parable, and Jesus would say, are you still without understanding? Or Matthew 16, when he confesses Jesus is Lord, but then he goes on to rebuke Jesus when Jesus tries to say, here's what's going to happen down the road. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. Or chapter 17, when they're on that Mount of Transfiguration, and Peter says we need to set up a tent for Moses and for Elijah and for Jesus, like they're all on the same plane. And yet he's corrected by the voice of God from heaven. Or the time Peter argued about Jesus not paying a tax, and Jesus says, no, here's how we're going to handle that. Or in chapter 18, when he asks how many times he should forgive someone, up to 7 times. And Jesus says, no, 70 times 7. And so there's a list of times where Peter does things impulsively that don't always put him in the best light. And I think this is one of those times. He's impulsive, and I think in a way that's why we can relate to him. Either way, no matter whose idea it was, Jesus tells him to come to him. So Jesus accepts this idea that Peter has. And so by doing that, Peter does get out of the boat, and you can imagine what it would be like to try to walk on water. Even someone who had spent so much time around water in his adult life, but Peter's experiencing a first. And he walks to Jesus. And as we continue reading in Matthew 14, we find out what happens when he sees the wind in verse 30. He was afraid. He looked around and he saw the wind, even in the midst of doing something incredible. Even in the midst of doing something he had never done before. As far as we know, he's the only other person other than Jesus to be able to walk on water. And even in the midst of this incredible time, the wind around him struck fear in his heart. I wonder if there aren't times in our lives where we might be even experiencing something incredible, something incredibly exciting or faith-building, and we still are afraid of what's around us. And because of that fear, he begins to sink. But Jesus, that calm presence in the middle of chaos, is there and saves him. It's an incredible picture, and it's a reminder that even in our darkest fears, Jesus is with us. It's humbling for me to think about sharing a passage like this with you. The reason it's humbling is because I know that in our lives, you are experiencing, many of you, times of chaos and fear. And I don't know everyone's situation, but I just know that if we were to sit down, there would probably be many of you in this room who are experiencing something that's beyond my ability to even understand. Even if you explain it to me, if I've never experienced it, I won't really know how you feel. And sometimes that's discouraging for me to think, how can we share a message like this when there's so much chaos going on? And yet, we're reminded that Jesus' presence is there. Do I remember the lesson of the loaves? When I'm in the middle of a storm, can I remember the lesson that Jesus taught? He was able to provide food for those who need it. He was able to walk in the midst of a storm. And in my own life, Jesus can do the same. There's a lot of chaos around us. It doesn't matter how many studies come back and tell us that we're supposedly safer now than we've ever been at any point in our history. We see the news. We see the tragedy. We see the senseless destruction that's around us, and it's scary. And it doesn't matter how much planning we do for our lives. If the last few years have taught us anything, it's that there are elements beyond our control when it comes to the economy, when it comes to war, when it comes to decisions that are made that are out of our hands, and we struggle and we don't know exactly how to deal with those things. It's chaotic and it can be scary. And it's good for us to be reminded that Jesus is in the storm. The presence is with us. Sometimes the storm is stilled, and the winds stop and the waves stop, and Jesus says, "Peace, be still." Sometimes the storm continues, and Jesus shows us his presence, but every time he is with us. And even if you were to come to a worship service, and even to share with one of the members here, we might not always know how to respond, and we might not always know how to understand what you're going through, but there's one who does. There's one who's there in the midst of the chaos and in the midst of the fear. And the good news is we didn't come here this morning to try to find the perfect answer from a human being. We came here this morning to be reminded that the same Jesus who walked on the water is the one who meets us in the waters of baptism. And when I become a Christian, when I put Christ on in baptism, I'm living a life that is assured that the presence of the I Am is there with me.
Graymere Church of Christ is a congregation of Christians who believe the Bible is the inspired Word of God. Following the New Testament pattern, we're trying to meet the needs of the people in this community and throughout the world. We invite you to worship with us at Graymere Church of Christ, which meets at 1320 Trotwood Avenue in Columbia, Tennessee. You'll always receive a warm welcome. If you have a question or comment about today's program, call 931-388-4796. We hope you will join us again next week as we study the Bible.